Okay, so kind of continuing from that, we're going to go through those same steps around the social studies example, so you can kind of get a feel. And you already, the questions you were asking there kind of led to this kind of thinking. So if you look at the one where it says Industrial Revolution at the top, obviously, again, Laura went through, I believe, the first three pieces, so you can see the unit title there. And I will say that on the website, so let me source this real quick. On the website, our Wyoming website that we're using for our resources, I did add at the bottom, there is this statewide project going on around social studies. And so I put in the actual model, but then this is the link. It's called PASST. And so what I did here, and if you go there, I forgot to say you got to log in as guest. Oops. Might have to adjust this if I... Okay, there we go. So if you click on that link, you might have to do log in as guest, and then go back and click on the link again, and it should take you there. But this, what I was able to do is to actually go to the test booklet, and this was already designed around this exact work. And so I'm just going to take this assessment and kind of break down the work that was done. So what we did here was they took a set of standards, so the unit, Industrial Revolution. As it happens in social studies, there are 4 standards that fit within that Industrial Revolution time frame. Social studies standards are, at least the content expectations are they're written, are the biggest standards around. They are 2 to 3 sentences long, at least, with examples, and they're very broad and very tough to break down. So knowing that the title is obviously going to be Industrial Revolution, you then need to really dig into the language. And what you see posted here is actually the condensed version. The full standard is on the little handout, the little 2-pager you were given that has social studies at the top. So what I did then was I went through, using the assessment in front of you here as kind of my model, and I kind of broke down how this worked. And it literally was a matter of teachers sitting around a table and just having a conversation around each of the standards and what they spoke to. So it was a designated note taker, you were having conversations, and you see that that first standard, 6.1.1, speaks to factors in the American Industrial Revolution. Analyze the factors, etc., 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 which may include, and then it lists out those different elements. So what happened at that point then is, based on their conversation, they started talking about, okay, so students are going to have to determine certain things or analyze certain things. And so they started just taking notes and writing this down, and then they went back and said, all right, so based on the conversation we just had, what is it that we need students to actually show here? And so what they came up with, again, is then listed down below, where I put on the learning targets. So the way that's set up for these learning targets are, they broke that standard down into 2 big ideas. And the way they are written, they actually are focusing on the same thing. So as social studies experts, they made the determination that even though the standard gives other examples of factors that led to the American Industrial Revolution, they're saying the most impactful component had to do with that economic policies of government and industrial leaders. So how did economic policies lead up with, or match up with, what the industrial leaders wanted at the time? That was the thing that was the most influential. Therefore, that's where they decided to focus. And you see, they created 2 different learning targets down below that they were going to speak to. They followed that same process through those different standards, determining what are the big ideas that students need to show in their learning, and then what is the content around that. And then how that was gauged is how they were then written. And based on the examples they then could provide, they determined what that depth of knowledge was. And so by just kind of identifying some of the different things that were going on, they obviously settled on certain depths of knowledge, which I think we're going to get to next, right? I'm jumping the gun a little bit. So what was done here was more of a conversation. And I know this because this was actually done in practice. So they had the conversation, they fleshed out, they took notes, and then they went back and kind of analyzed. How complex of a skill is it to identify or to analyze these different things? They made the determination from there that these are the 2 big points of learning. Put that down, and then we'll get more into that depth of knowledge piece in a second. Any questions about that? So maybe to speak a little bit to the ELA piece, as you write that assessment then, part of your unit then becomes that grammar standard, right? So you have your other standards going on, put that grammar standard within that, and then it becomes a part of the conversation, and then maybe it's a more natural fit. So you know what I mean? It naturally will put that in there too. And then you could do that through question types like Allison suggested. Maybe it's this excerpt from the book, you know, look at this sentence in particular, how could this sentence be written more correctly, whether they add a comma or they pick from one of 4 choices or whatever. So, along that line. All right. Oh, sorry.
As I look at your examples, this is kind of an administrative question, I guess. Rather than a question to you guys, but as I look at your examples, what you're suggesting is that right now we have a standard and one assessment for that standard. And a standard and one assessment for that standard. And a standard, what you're saying is sometimes it might be best to have several standards or several learning targets that can be tested all at one time.
Yes, I think for the math, actually, that makes more sense. Just because I know that for the math, with the coherence, with the way that the standards are written, the kids will get assessed with standards clumped together. So it's, instead of it being, isolated standard by standard, which is what we used to do, which is how the MEP assessed it, moving forward, it's going to be better to group them together. Oh, I didn't mean to answer for somebody. I'm sorry.
Agreed. We had 4 discussions too. Last week around quarter going into fourth quarter. That being said, we also have to be mindful of, as we compact those, there are skills that with that assessment, formative and eventually summative piece, you have enough information to group the formula and you can compact it to be able to think of those out and understand where it might not be at grade level or lesson design and planning and
Yep.
all really intense, but I think we have to keep those things in mind too, as we do the process of change.
So be careful though that where you're clumping them together in assessment, as you saw from the learning targets, there's still the skills he was referencing are still separated out.
Absolutely.
So even though
rubric for different standards,
right,
or a different
right.
way to grade.
And you obviously, these are suggested blueprints, and you guys are going to design the blueprints that are going to best fit.
Makes perfect sense. 4th grade 14 standards. Everyone's make a lot of sense to read important.
Right.
Also, the discussions and generally, student as a whole, like when we do a Delta Math test, gives you that overall 10,000 foot view of what your score is, but maybe splinter that out to look at quickly degree standards that would be high level for them. So the other ones, it's compensating because they did so well on it, so the overall score doesn't do that.
And I think the ELA standards, speaking more to the ELA side, the way the Common Core State Standards are written now, I think it helps to think this way to transition to how the standards are now written versus what they were, right? Content expectations were very much down to the detail. These are a little more broad and general, and we're left going, ah! So I think this process maybe kind of helps flesh out those skills and helps us see the, from the ELA side of it.
And I also think this is the point where we talked, I think it was in the first or second session, how many questions do you have per learning target, per standard, and that whole professional judgment comes in because you are professionals. And you have to determine what's going to be appropriate for your students. And so a lot of you said some of our assessments are really long. And so as we get into our 4th and 5th steps within this process, you're going to start taking a look. Are we assessing this learning target way too many times within one assessment? How many questions are enough questions? And what length is appropriate for our students? So I think all of those are factors in determining how many standards you're going to use within your assessment as well.
And Laura,
Absolutely.
would it be fair to say too, because you guys had mentioned it, like on how you're dealing with grammar, that you're doing some of that as within formative assessments in your classrooms. So, how many, or in which ways could we use formative assessments to measure some of what kids are learning and still have that be counted as data that we might need to bring to the table in conversations about where kids are at, with their learning?
Absolutely. Formative assessments and summative assessments need to be used in conjunction with each other. And just because it's identified as a formative, it doesn't mean that it can't count for their learning, because it is their learning along the way. You're assessing that. And if you at some point determine, you know what, this is the formative assessment, but they've got it, let me give a score to that. That becomes summative, and you're able to move on with their learning. So those formative assessments are essential and sometimes hit some of those targets that you may not formally assess. And Mark and I had this conversation, I think, a couple weeks ago about how do we make sure we're assessing what we need to, although it may not show up on the summative assessment. And so we're really looking at the blueprint for that summative assessment for that end of unit. Doesn't mean you haven't touched on all the targets they need to learn in that unit. You just may have done so formatively and decided, yep, they've got that. Okay, so we're going to have you get to work and start applying your new knowledge that you've gained through our last couple days together. And we're going to have you either on the paper copy, or you can again go to that Wyoming Google Doc and get a link to an Excel document that has the blueprint in it, and identify your unit title, identify the standards that you teach in that unit, and then go ahead and deconstruct those standards into learning targets and put those in the blueprint. You're not necessarily going to do one per person. You can work as teams on this, which is encouraged, because this is your practice. You're going to have a lot of time to work together today. So even this first one, you might want to practice together and just get started with those first 3 steps. Let us know what questions you have along the way. We're going to give you plenty of time to get to work. Okay? Any questions before we release you? Okay.